My daughter stood at the edge of the kitchen, her arms crossed like a stranger ready to evict a tenant. Her voice was cold when she said it. Either you start doing what Derek asks, or you can pack your things and leave. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. Instead, I nodded once, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled down the old suitcase I had packed 3 days ago. Not because I expected this, but because deep down, I knew. I left quietly, without slamming doors or demanding explanations. I left the house I had bought, the home I had once filled with laughter and Sunday dinners. She was waiting for me to beg, to bargain, but this time, I gave her nothing. 7 days later, my phone showed 19 missed calls. But by then, I had already taken back everything they thought they owned.
Before we continue, do me a favor. Hit like and subscribe so you never miss what's next.
When my daughter told me I could either start doing what her husband asked or pack my bags and leave, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her to repeat herself. I didn't even look surprised. I just nodded, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled down the suitcase I had quietly packed 3 days earlier. It wasn't out of paranoia or pride. It was instinct. The kind of instinct you develop after a lifetime of watching people slowly forget the difference between generosity and obligation. I didn't say anything to Jenna as I moved past her. I didn't look at Derek sprawled out on the recliner I had once bought for Elaine when her chemotherapy made it hard to sit up for long. He had his feet up, one arm slung lazily over the armrest, beer bottle dangling like a crown. I didn't say a word. I walked down the hall, set the suitcase on the bed, and began packing the last things I needed. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, socks, underwear, medication, my ledger notebook, a small box with Elaine's photo and her silver bracelet, the one she wore every day of our marriage. I wrapped it in a hand towel and tucked it into a side pocket. The entire house stayed quiet behind me, except for the muffled voices coming from the television in the living room and the occasional shifting of Derek's weight in my chair. When I returned to the front door, Jenna was standing beside the dining table with her arms crossed. She didn't ask where I was going. She didn't ask if I had anywhere to stay. She just said, "Dad, if this is how you want to handle things, then that's your decision." I said nothing. I opened the door, stepped out into the early evening light, and let it close quietly behind me. The air smelled like clipped grass and the tail end of summer. I walked to my Mercury Sable, slid the suitcase into the back seat, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment before turning the key. It started without hesitation, just like it always had. I drove away from the house I had paid for, from the family I had protected, from the daughter I had given everything to, hoping she would grow into someone better than this. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. Whispering Pines Inn was 28 minutes away, tucked behind a set of maple trees just off the state highway. It wasn't fancy, single-story, 12 rooms, gravel parking lot, but it was clean, and the desk clerk didn't ask questions when I handed over my ID. Room 6 faced the backwoods. Quiet, private. That's all I needed. I unpacked slowly, placing my clothes into the narrow dresser and Elaine's picture on the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. It smelled like old wood and lemon cleaner. I didn't mind. It reminded me of the cabins we used to rent when we went fishing in the Windpine Valley. Simpler times. Times when I still believed that family meant something deeper than convenience. I turned off the lamp and laid back. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Not because of anger. Not because of regret. Because of clarity. Clarity has a weight to it. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I finally closed my eyes. The next morning I woke to the sound of birds outside the window and the light tap of housekeeping passing by. I sat up, checked my phone, and saw the first missed call from Jenna. No message, just a single missed call. I went down to the front desk and got a cup of coffee from the lobby pot, bitter and strong, just the way Elaine used to like it. I sat on the bench outside and watched the parking lot for a while. No one came or went. I liked that. By noon, there were 2 more missed calls, then another one before sunset. I didn't return any of them. That evening, I drove into town and stopped at the small grocery store on Willow Street. I picked up bread, peanut butter, coffee, canned soup, crackers, and a pack of cigarettes I didn't plan to smoke, just in case. At the checkout, the clerk, a teenager with a nose ring and a tired smile, asked how my day was going. I told her it was just beginning. Back at the motel, I poured a glass of water, opened a can of soup, and sat at the small table by the window while it warmed in the microwave. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable. I had been living in a house filled with noise for 5 years, and most of it wasn't mine. Derek watching TV at full volume, Jenna on her phone in the kitchen, doors slamming, arguments behind closed doors, laughter that never included me. I didn't miss any of it. After dinner, I opened my notebook and began listing expenses: mortgage payments, car insurance, groceries, student loan contributions, credit card debt, wedding costs, utility bills. 5 years of keeping them afloat while they pretended it was all normal. While they let me pay their way and then called me difficult when I asked for help unloading groceries. By the end of the night, the missed call count was up to 8. I turned off the phone and went to bed. The next day followed the same rhythm. Walks through the quiet part of town, coffee at the diner, a few polite nods from people who didn't know or didn't ask. Another 3 missed calls. By Thursday, it was up to 14. By Saturday morning, 22. That was the number. The one they would remember. Not because I didn't answer, but because after that, everything began to change. And none of them were ready for what came next. The calls kept coming for 2 more days. Most were from Jenna. A few came from Derek, though his number showed up less often. None left voicemails. On the 7th day, Colin turned the phone off and slid it into the drawer next to the bed. He'd already memorized the silence. At 7:30 that morning, he walked down to the lobby and asked the clerk if there was a notary public in town. The woman behind the desk pointed him to a small print shop next to the post office. Colin thanked her and made a note in his journal. He ate breakfast at the diner across the street from the motel. Scrambled eggs, toast, black coffee. No one rushed him. No one stared. It was the first meal he'd had in years where he didn't feel like a shadow at someone else's table. After breakfast, he drove into the center of Ravenshade. The town was small: 3 stoplights, a library, 2 banks, and a city hall that looked like it hadn't been painted in a decade. Colin parked outside Harborstone Union Bank and took a deep breath before going inside. The woman at the front desk remembered him. She called him Mr. Hargrove and offered him a seat in one of the small glass offices. He asked for a balance sheet, full withdrawal forms, and the contact information for the manager of his retirement trust. By noon, he had closed 2 accounts, paused auto payments tied to his daughter's address, and instructed the bank to reject all third-party authorizations moving forward. The woman didn't ask why. She only said, "We'll get that processed for you right away." Colin nodded and said, "I appreciate it." He walked out of the bank with 2 cashier's checks and a folder of documents. It wasn't about the money, it was about the message. They would no longer spend what they didn't earn, not on his back. Back at the motel, he sat at the desk and opened his laptop. He pulled up insurance records, credit reports, and vehicle registrations. Derek's truck and Jenna's Civic were both listed under Colin's policy. He'd been paying premiums for years, bundled neatly under the Falcon Crest name. He called the agent and asked to remove both vehicles. The man on the line asked if he wanted to replace them with something else. Colin said, "No, just clean removals, effective immediately." Within 20 minutes, it was done. Next, he contacted Union Line, the credit card company Jenna used when she was in school. She had never opened her own account. Colin had added her as an authorized user when she was 21 and needed a flight home for a funeral. She never stepped off the card. Now he asked them to shut down the account entirely, pay off the balance, terminate the line. The representative said, "We hate to see you go, Mr. Hargrove. Is there anything we can offer?" Colin cut her off gently. "I'm just simplifying." Before dinner, he made 2 more calls. The first was to the registrar's office at the university where Jenna had taken night classes. He requested a copy of her tuition receipts. He needed to know exactly how much he had paid for her schooling, down to the penny. The second was to Green Line Motors, where Derek claimed to work full-time. Colin asked for HR and posed as a lender looking to verify income for a refinancing deal. The woman confirmed what he already suspected. Derek was a part-time contractor, not salaried, and frequently late on hours. Colin thanked her and hung up. That night, he pulled out the folder he kept under his suitcase. Inside was a notarized letter he had written 3 months earlier. It had sat sealed, unsigned, waiting for a moment like this. The letter transferred full ownership of 129 Briar Glen Road, the house they lived in, to Echo Haven Veterans Trust. He signed it now and dated the bottom. The next morning, he delivered it to the print shop for official filing. The clerk behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with silver bangs and kind eyes, looked up at him as he handed it over. She asked, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Colin nodded once. "It's already done. I just need the paperwork to match." She said nothing more, just stamped the documents and handed him a receipt. By Friday afternoon, Colin had finished unwinding everything. Mortgage, canceled, utilities, cut off, credit cards, closed, insurance, removed, registrations, updated. There was nothing left tying him to the life he had built for them. They had stripped him of dignity in that house. They had spoken to him like a burden, treated his kindness like an invoice. Now they would have to live without it. That night, he made himself a sandwich and sat outside room 6 with a paper plate in his lap. The crickets were loud in the trees. A breeze moved through the branches like a whisper he couldn't quite catch. Colin closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The world didn't feel smaller. It felt clearer. And in that stillness, for the first time in years, he smiled. By the second week, Raven shades started to notice. It began with whispers, quiet ones, passed along checkout counters and coffee tables, slipping through the hair salon and the church foyer, like a slow leak in a tire no one wanted to patch too quickly. People didn't know the whole story. They never do. But they had noticed that Colin Hargrove, who used to carry his groceries in a canvas bag every Thursday morning and wave to the crossing guard on Elm Street, hadn't been seen near Briar Glen Road in days. And the house, the one with the white porch swing and the red shutters, looked different. A window had been left open too long. A trash bin sat on the curb for nearly a week. Derek's truck was parked in the grass instead of the driveway, and someone had thrown out a set of plastic patio chairs. The first person to ask questions was Mrs. Evelyn Cross. She lived 2 doors down, had seen Colin trim his hedges every Saturday for a decade, and now noticed the grass had gone to seed. She saw Jenna one afternoon and asked how her father was doing. Jenna replied that he was resting somewhere for a while, said it with a smile, like it was all part of some planned vacation. But Evelyn knew better. She always did. At Grace Hollow Church, Pastor Kellerman mentioned Colin during prayer announcements. He asked if anyone had spoken to him lately. No one answered. A few heads turned. Derek and Jenna didn't show up that Sunday or the one after. The absence grew louder than any rumor. Colin, meanwhile, stayed quiet. He spent his mornings walking the loop behind Whispering Pines, a trail that curved along a shallow creek and looped around an old mill no one used anymore. He carried a thermos of coffee and a small paperback most days. Sometimes he didn't read, just sat on the bench and listened to the water. He had always been the type to let things settle before he acted. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about setting the record straight, not with words, but with boundaries. The calls had slowed. After the 22nd, there were a few more, then nothing. But word still traveled. Someone at Green Line Motors let it slip that Derek's car insurance had lapsed. He showed up to work late 3 days in a row, complaining about bills and blaming the DMV. He was overheard saying something about his father-in-law, cutting the cord like a damn executioner. Jenna's phone was shut off for 2 days. She had to borrow a co-worker's to reschedule an appointment. She told someone at the salon that it was just a glitch with the billing. It wasn't. People pieced together what they could. Some assumed Colin had been forced out. Others guessed it was health-related. A few suspected something deeper. But no one really knew, and that made it worse for them. Silence always fills in the blanks more brutally than facts. Colin went to the hardware store one morning to pick up a replacement bulb for the lamp on his nightstand. Ernie Delaney, the owner, looked up from the register and paused when he saw him. "Hadn't seen you in a while," Ernie said. Colin nodded, just laying low. Ernie handed him the bulb without ringing it up. "On the house," he said. "Always appreciated the way you helped with the snowplow situation last winter." Colin didn't argue, just said thank you and walked out. He stopped by the diner that afternoon and left a $20 bill on the counter after a $6 lunch. The waitress didn't say anything, but she watched him walk out the door with a look that lasted longer than usual. By week's end, the letter from the courthouse had been delivered to 129 Briar Glen Road. It arrived in a plain envelope, addressed to current occupants. Inside was a formal notice of property transfer. Echo Haven Veterans Trust had officially been granted custodianship of the home. There was no buyout clause, no lease option, just 30 days of occupancy before legal transition. Jenna read it first. Derek didn't believe it until he called the number on the document and spoke to a coordinator who confirmed everything. Colin had left, but he hadn't disappeared. He had simply erased them from the foundation they thought would always hold them. That night, Jenna tried to call again. The number didn't connect, not blocked, just inactive. Derek paced the living room and cursed, throwing his empty beer bottle into the trash with more force than necessary. Outside, the porch light flickered. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side, and the grass kept growing. By the time the third week rolled around, the cracks started to show. Derek was the first to lose control of the narrative. He started showing up late to Greenline Motors more often than not. The shop manager pulled him aside after he missed a Friday delivery shift, asking if everything at home was okay. Derek waved it off, just said things were tight and his phone was acting up. The truth was harder to explain. His name had never been on the house deed, or the bank account, or the insurance. For 5 years, he had lived like the floor beneath him was permanent. Now, every time the mail came, it was another reminder that nothing was in his name. The utility bills that used to auto-pay on the 5th didn't clear. The power company sent a notice. The gas line was up for reconnection unless someone came into the office. Jenna tried to handle it, but when she gave the address, the woman on the phone said the account had been closed. Jenna asked to open a new one. The deposit required was more than what they had in checking. That same day, the Civic needed brakes. Derek went to the shop on credit, only to find his name had been removed from the Savers Club membership. The manager shrugged, said the card was invalid. Derek left the car overnight and walked home. Jenna was waiting in the kitchen. Her eyes were swollen, red. She had just come from the post office where she picked up another legal packet from the court. It wasn't just a property transfer notice. It included paperwork showing Colin had cleared the mortgage 5 years ago, then donated the estate. She didn't cry, but she sat down hard on the edge of the kitchen chair and said, "I think we screwed this up." Derek didn't answer. He opened the fridge, grabbed the last beer, and stared at the nearly empty shelves inside. Jenna tried calling her dad again later that night. The number still didn't work. She sat on the back step in the dark and scrolled through old photos on her phone. Birthdays, barbecues, Colin holding up a small cake with her name on it when she got the job at the bank. None of those memories helped now. She texted a friend from church and asked if she had seen Colin. The reply came hours later. "I think he's staying at Whispering Pines. I heard from someone at the diner." Not sure. Jenna didn't go there. Not yet. Instead, she and Derek spent the next few days trying to get their name on something. Anything. They called the county records office trying to challenge the house deed. But the paperwork was flawless. Notarized, filed, and processed. It wasn't abandonment. It was transfer. They tried to refinance Derek's truck, but without a co-signer and no steady salary, the bank declined. Jenna reached out to an old college friend for a short-term loan. The friend politely declined and didn't return future texts. By Thursday, Derek missed another shift. That night, a final notice arrived from Falcon Crest Insurance. The cars were officially off the policy. They had 72 hours to insure or remove them from the road. Derek kicked the trash can down the driveway in the dark. It split open and dumped its contents into the street. Jenna watched from the window and said nothing. At Whispering Pines, Colin sat quietly in his room with the lamp on and a stack of books by the bed. He had finished updating his will earlier that day, transferring his remaining assets to a trust with limited disbursement instructions. No direct payouts, just guidelines. If Jenna came around, she would have to speak to the estate manager, a quiet man with a strict schedule and no patience for pity. Colin didn't hate her. He had never hated her, but he had stopped protecting her from herself. The motel clerk slipped a note under his door that evening. It was from Mrs. Cross, the neighbor from 2 doors down. She had heard what happened and said she had a few things that belonged to Elaine. Would he like to have them? Colin called her the next morning and thanked her. They agreed to meet that weekend at Grace Hollow Church during the Saturday food drive. She brought a small bag, a scarf, a book of pressed flowers, and a set of measuring spoons Elaine had used for baking. Colin took them with quiet hands and said they still smelled like cinnamon. They sat on the bench outside for a while. Mrs. Cross didn't ask questions. She just said, "Some people take kindness as weakness, others take it as permission. You gave them both." Colin didn't respond. He didn't need to. He returned to the motel and placed the scarf in the drawer, the flowers on the desk, and the spoons in the small kitchen space beside the sink. By Sunday morning, Ravenshade knew more than the Fosters wanted. At Grace Hollow, Pastor Kellerman mentioned Derek by name during announcements, asked for prayers, said we all know when pride turns to poison. No one looked surprised. The letter came on a Tuesday. It was delivered by hand, pinned between the front door and the frame with a strip of blue painter's tape. Jenna found it first. She stood on the porch for a long time before pulling it loose. Inside was the final notice, the kind written on crisp white paper with dates and deadlines, stamped and notarized, carrying the weight of law. She read it twice, then sat down on the porch swing and didn't move for a full hour. The house she had grown up in would no longer be hers, not in spirit, not in memory, and certainly not in writing. She folded the letter and placed it on the coffee table inside, face down, like a wound she wasn't ready to look at again. Derek came home just after 7. He noticed the silence before he even opened the door. The TV was off. No music, no lights in the kitchen. Jenna handed him the letter without a word. He read it, jaw tightening. He flipped the page over, as if expecting a second version. A mistake, a loophole, something. There wasn't. They had 30 days, no extensions, no negotiations. Just a final move-out date, after which Echo Haven Veterans Trust would assume control of the property. Derek tossed the letter on the counter and swore under his breath. He opened the fridge, grabbed a beer, then changed his mind and poured a glass of water instead. Jenna sat at the table, elbows on the wood, fingers pressed against her temples. She said she didn't know where they would go. Said she couldn't call her mother, not after what happened, and Derek's brother had 3 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment. Derek didn't respond. He stared at the wall and said, "We'll figure it out." But they both knew that meant nothing. The next day, Jenna drove to the courthouse. She asked to speak to someone about the letter. The clerk pulled up the file and confirmed everything. The house belonged to the trust now. Transfer complete. Any challenges would need to go through civil court, but the odds were slim. The clerk said, "I'm sorry. You were listed as an occupant, not an owner." Jenna nodded, thanked her, and walked out into the parking lot where she sat in the car for 15 minutes before starting the engine. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she went home, opened a photo album from the hallway closet, and flipped through the pages. Colin holding her as a toddler. Colin teaching her how to ride a bike. Colin standing beside her at graduation with his hands on her shoulders. She closed the album and placed it gently in a cardboard box. At Whispering Pines, Colin heard about the notice from a man named Samuel, who worked part-time as a groundskeeper at the church. Samuel had seen Jenna sitting alone in the back row during Wednesday night service. She hadn't taken communion. She hadn't spoken to anyone. Just sat with her hands folded, eyes closed. Samuel said he felt bad for her. Said maybe Colin should reach out. Colin didn't answer right away. He just folded his paper and placed it on the table beside him. Then he said, "She knows where I am." That night, Colin received a letter of his own. It came from Echo Haven, a formal confirmation of transfer with a note of gratitude and an invitation to attend the public announcement ceremony in October. He set the letter aside and made tea instead. Across town, Derek was pacing the driveway. He had taken the day off work to call banks, but none of them were willing to offer financing without collateral. The house had been his plan. He was going to refinance it, pull equity, use it to cover his own debts and Jenna's lingering credit cards. Now the plan was gone, and he was left with nothing but unpaid bills and the realization that Colin had dismantled it all piece by piece. Derek kicked the porch post and cracked the wood. Jenna told him to stop, that it wouldn't help. He told her she should have done more. She told him he never did enough. They didn't speak again for the rest of the night. The next morning, a moving van pulled up to the neighbor's house. Evelyn Cross watched from her window and quietly wondered how long it would take for the Fosters to leave. She didn't say anything out loud, just made a casserole and dropped it off at the church pantry with Colin's name written on the lid in black marker. Colin picked it up later that afternoon. He didn't need the food, but he took it anyway. He reheated it in the motel microwave and sat at the little table by the window, looking out at the tree line as the sun dipped behind the hills. He thought about Elaine, about what she would have said if she had seen how things turned out. Then he opened his journal and wrote, "You can give someone everything you have, but they'll still call it not enough if they never learned how to be grateful." Jenna didn't get out of bed for almost 2 days. She said she had a cold, told Derek she just needed rest. But the truth was simpler than that. She was tired. Tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Tired of the tension, the silence, the weight of everything collapsing at once. The house felt smaller now. Every creak in the floorboards reminded her of Colin. Every photo on the wall looked like a memory she didn't deserve to keep. Derek came and went. He was trying to salvage what he could. He drove out to his uncle's scrapyard, asked if they had any room in the back office. The answer was maybe, no promises. He checked apartment listings, but anything they could afford was too far from town or in places Jenna refused to live. On Sunday morning, Jenna forced herself out of bed, showered, and put on a dress. She walked to Grace Hollow Church alone. Derek stayed home, said he didn't feel like pretending. She sat in the back row again, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes on the floor. When the choir started to sing, she looked up just for a second and thought she saw her father's reflection in the stained glass. But it was just sunlight catching on the curve of the window. After service, Pastor Kellerman approached her. He didn't ask questions, just placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "We all fall short. The good news is we're allowed to begin again." She nodded, tried to thank him. Her voice caught in her throat. That afternoon, she walked to the edge of Briar Glen Road and stood by the mailbox. She stared down the street, past the curve that led out of the neighborhood, and wondered if Colin had ever looked back. She didn't think so. Back at the motel, Colin sat at his desk writing letters. Not to Jenna, not to Derek, to the board members of Echo Haven. Thank you notes, simple words, clean handwriting. He believed in finishing things right, even if the people involved didn't deserve that courtesy. He didn't ask for updates, didn't check in on the house. He had made his choices. Now it was theirs to live with. One of the letters he wrote was to his lawyer. A short message, just confirming that the last round of account closures had gone through. He also asked for an update on the trust fund protections. He didn't want Jenna to receive anything until she proved she could stand on her own. That was the condition, and Warren knew better than to argue. Back at 129 Briar Glen, the silence was growing heavier. Derek's frustration boiled over that night. He slammed a cabinet door after finding out the internet had been shut off. Jenna told him she didn't know what else to do. He told her she never had a plan to begin with. She snapped back, told him maybe if he worked more and drank less, they wouldn't be here. He threw a glass across the kitchen. It shattered against the tile. No one cleaned it up. They slept in separate rooms that night. On Tuesday, Jenna took a walk through town. She passed the diner but didn't go in. She passed the library but didn't stop. When she reached the park, she sat on the bench near the pond and watched the ducks paddle in slow circles. An older woman sat down beside her. It took Jenna a moment to recognize her. Mrs. Cross. She lived 2 doors down, had known her family since she was in grade school. Mrs. Cross said, "I saw your father last week. Looked good, healthier than I've seen him in years." Jenna nodded, said she was glad to hear it. Mrs. Cross waited a beat, then said, "You know, sometimes losing something is the only way we learn what we're holding." Jenna didn't respond. She just looked down at her hands. When she got home, she found Derek in the garage, packing a cardboard box with random tools. He said they should start moving things, said it didn't make sense to wait until the last minute. She said okay, then went inside and stared at the wall for over an hour before moving. That night, she found Colin's old fishing jacket hanging in the back of the coat closet. She took it down, ran her fingers over the frayed collar, and held it close for a few seconds longer than she meant to. Then she folded it neatly and placed it in the box marked "Donate." Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, the foundation they had mistaken for permanent kept shifting beneath their feet. Jenna didn't tell Derek when she went to see her father. She waited until he left for work on Thursday, then pulled on a sweater, locked the front door behind her, and drove across town to Whispering Pines. She didn't bring anything with her. No apology letter, no prepared speech, just a knot in her stomach and 100 versions of the conversation she'd rehearsed but never finished. The motel looked smaller than she remembered. Older, too. The paint was fading along the trim, and the lot was half empty. She parked beside a pickup truck with rust along the bumper and walked slowly toward room 6. For a moment, she thought about turning around, leaving before she had to see the look on his face, the disappointment, the distance. But then the door opened. Colin stood in the frame, calm as ever. He didn't look surprised. He didn't say anything right away, just nodded once and stepped aside. Jenna walked in. The room smelled like coffee and cedar. There was a book on the nightstand, a half-empty mug on the desk. A photo of her mother sat beside the lamp, the frame worn smooth along the edges. Jenna sat on the edge of the chair near the window. Colin remained standing. She said she didn't come to argue, said she wasn't there to ask for anything. She just needed to see him, to know he was okay. He nodded, said he was, then asked if she was. She didn't answer right away. Then she said no. She told him the house was quiet, too quiet, that Derek wasn't handling things well, that she wasn't sure how much longer they could stay together. She said she missed the mornings when he'd be sitting at the kitchen table, reading the paper, humming under his breath, that she missed how the house felt like home when he was in it. Colin listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't soften. When she finished, he said, "I told you I'd never leave unless I was asked to." Jenna's eyes welled up. She said she didn't mean it like that she was angry, overwhelmed, that she thought he'd fight back, not walk away. He said he'd fought enough for one lifetime, that when someone shows you where they think you belong, the wise thing to do is leave before they lock the door behind you. Jenna wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. She asked if there was anything left, any way to make things right. Colin didn't answer at first. He walked to the desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to her and said, "That's a conditional release. You sign it, you agree to walk away from the house quietly. No court battles, no appeals. In return, you'll receive a portion of the trust's housing support, enough to cover your first year somewhere else. After that, you're on your own." Jenna held the envelope in her lap. She didn't open it. She asked if he hated her. He said no. He just stopped trying to convince her he mattered. She sat there for a long time before standing. She said thank you, turned toward the door, then paused and asked if she could come back sometime. Not to ask for anything, just to talk. Colin said the door wasn't locked, but he wouldn't be waiting by it either. She left. That night, she sat in the living room of the house she no longer owned, envelope still unopened on the table, and watched the shadows stretch across the floor. Derek came home late. He asked where she'd been. She told him. He asked if she got anything out of it. She said she wasn't sure. He poured himself a drink and said, "He's not coming back, you know. He's too proud," Jenna said. "Maybe that's what it takes sometimes." They didn't speak for the rest of the night. Across town, Colin sat at his desk and wrote a letter to the trust manager. He told them Jenna had been by, told them to keep the offer active for 7 days. After that, close it permanently. Then he turned off the lamp, sat on the bed, and stared at the photo of Elaine for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, everything remained still. The church was quiet when Colin arrived. It was just after 8 on a Saturday morning. The sun was barely above the treetops, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of the old wooden sign out front. He walked in through the side entrance, nodding to the janitor who was unlocking the supply closet. The sanctuary smelled like lemon oil and dust, familiar, unchanged. Pastor Kellerman was already at the pulpit, arranging hymn sheets. He looked up, surprised but not startled. Colin walked to the front row and sat down. They didn't speak for a while, just shared the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Then Colin said he wanted to speak. Just a few words, nothing formal. The pastor nodded, said he could have the floor before the service started, said folks would be glad to hear from him. Colin didn't smile, just said, "Thank you." By 9:30, people started arriving. Families, widows, longtime members. Jenna came in just before the organist started warming up. She sat near the back alone. She hadn't signed the envelope yet, hadn't rejected it either. It sat on her dresser, untouched, waiting. Colin stepped up to the pulpit when the pastor introduced him. He adjusted the microphone once, then took a breath. He said he didn't come to make anyone uncomfortable, that he wasn't looking for pity, that he wasn't even sure he had the right words. Then he said that sometimes love gets mistaken for something else, something softer, something weaker. He said it took him a long time to realize that protecting people too much was its own kind of harm. He didn't name names, didn't share details, but people understood. He talked about gratitude, about the difference between sacrifice and expectation, about how easy it is to grow used to being carried without realizing the person carrying you is getting tired. He finished by saying he wasn't angry, just done, and that letting go doesn't always mean walking away. Sometimes it means staying exactly where you are and letting others decide whether they want to meet you there. He stepped down without applause. The room stayed quiet. After service, a few people came up to shake his hand. Mrs. Cross gave him a hug. The pastor asked him if he'd come back again next week. Colin said maybe. Jenna didn't approach him, but she didn't leave right away either. She stayed seated in the pew, staring at the stained glass, hands folded tightly in her lap. Colin walked past her on his way out. He didn't stop. That evening, he returned to the motel and opened the window for the first time in days. The air was crisp. Autumn was arriving early this year. He sat at the desk and wrote a letter to Elaine. He didn't write often, just when he needed to sort things out. He told her he missed her, told her the house was gone, told her Jenna came by, and maybe, just maybe, she'd find her way back. He didn't ask for anything in return, just wrote the words and closed the notebook. At Briar Glen, Jenna sat on the porch with the envelope in her lap. She had read it 3 times now. It was a way out, a clean one, but it came with a weight she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. Inside, Derek was asleep on the couch. His job at the garage was on the line. He hadn't shown up in 3 days. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt earned. The moving truck came on a Monday. It was early, just after sunrise. The driver stepped out, checked the address twice, then knocked on the front door of 129 Briar Glen Road. Derek answered in a t-shirt and jeans, hair uncombed, eyes tired. The man said they had orders to start packing, said the transfer deadline was in 2 days, but the trust preferred to get ahead of schedule. Derek didn't argue. He just stepped aside and told them to be careful with the lamp in the front room. Jenna was already in the kitchen, taping up boxes. She had started 2 nights ago, quietly, without saying much. The envelope Colin gave her was still sealed, but she had already made up her mind. They would leave before they were pushed. Some small thread of dignity left to pull from the wreckage. They didn't speak much as the house emptied. The truck filled slowly, couch, chairs, dressers, bins of clothes and books. It didn't look like much once it was all loaded. By mid-afternoon, the house was bare. Jenna stood in the living room and looked at the place one last time. The walls where childhood pictures once hung. The floor where her father taught her how to waltz when she was 7, humming off key. She didn't cry. She closed the door behind her and walked to the car. They didn't leave a forwarding address. 2 days later, a team from Echo Haven arrived. They brought paint, tools, a crew of volunteers. By the end of the week, the shutters had been replaced, the porch swing repaired, and the yard trimmed back to its original shape. Colin came by that Saturday. He stood across the street and watched as a single mother and her 2 sons stepped onto the porch for the first time. The boys ran through the yard laughing. The woman looked overwhelmed. He didn't introduce himself. He just watched for a few minutes, then turned and walked away. At Whispering Pines, the motel clerk asked if he'd be extending his stay. Colin said no. He had found a small apartment just outside town. Modest, quiet, enough space for a desk, a bed, and his books. He packed his suitcase that night, folded his clothes the same way he had that first evening, carefully, without rush. Before he left, he stopped by the diner one last time, ordered coffee, eggs, toast. The waitress smiled and told him the meal was on the house, said he'd been a favorite guest. He thanked her and left a tip that covered 3 more meals. Back in town, Pastor Kellerman read aloud a letter during Sunday service. It was from Colin. Short, simple. He thanked the church for its kindness, said he had learned that sometimes love doesn't look like forgiveness. Sometimes it just looks like letting go. People nodded. Mrs. Cross wiped her eyes with a tissue and said, "That man did it the right way." Jenna never replied to the letter, never signed the release. But one afternoon, a donation arrived at Echo Haven, a check for $200 with no name on it, just a note that said, "For the next person who needs a second chance." Colin never asked, he just moved on. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like something real.